I'm Myrna McCallum, Métis Cree lawyer and passionate promoter of trauma-informed lawyering. Welcome to my new podcast, The Trauma-Informed Lawyer, brought to you in partnership with the Canadian Bar Association. I believe that law schools and bar courses are missing a critical competency requirement in their curriculum, trauma-informed lawyering. Becoming a trauma-informed lawyer will, among other things, challenge you to critically reflect on your personal behaviors, beliefs, and biases, call on you to positively transform the way you approach advocacy, guide your practice to avoid doing further harm to others, and ask that you commit to remaining open to learn new and old knowledge you didn't know you needed before beginning your career. Your education starts right here, right now. This podcast comes to you from the traditional, unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. Hello, and welcome back. In my last episode, I posed a number of questions to you. What do you wish you would have learned at law school to help you respond to the fears or traumas of your clients? I would really like to know your answer. At the very least, your thoughts on the question. You can find me on Twitter @LegalTrauma or Instagram under the username The Trauma Informed Lawyer and share your answer there. I've been struggling to find the words to introduce today's guest in a way that he has not already been introduced by other hosts. Gabor Maté is so many things to so many people. Some of my therapist friends acknowledge him as the best educator on trauma and addictions I have ever learned from. Others recognize Gabor as the best-selling author of several award-winning books, including In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress, and Scattered Minds, A New Look at the Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder. He also co-authored a parenting book, which I just ordered for my daughter and son-in-law as they begin their journey to parenting, called Hold On to Your Kids. I came across Gabor's path a little while back, and we talked about the justice system and some of its shortcomings. I'm so happy that he took the time out of his writing schedule to talk with me and to share his views on how his compassionate inquiry approach could be used by lawyers in and out of the courtroom. Last time you and I had a conversation, we talked about an experience that you had in a courtroom. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about, how you experienced that whole process.
Sure. So the background was that I was contacted by a Vancouver legal aid counsel who was defending a man who admittedly had killed somebody. This man had a history of addiction and of various kinds. And what the lawyer wanted me to testify on was the defendant's state of mind given his addiction history. Now, my background is that I used to work for 12 years in Vancouver's downtown east side, working with a highly addicted population. I've extensively researched the addiction literature. I've written a book published internationally on the subject of addiction, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, a bestseller in this country and in the US, published abroad as well. I get invited to speak internationally to counselors, therapists, physicians, psychiatrists on issues of psychiatry, but also to legal personnel. So I've spoken to the Supreme Court judges of the Yukon. I've spoken to the Manitoba Bar Association, I think it's called. Prior to this trial, I was just in Melbourne, Australia, speaking to the Melbourne, Judges Association or some high court institution in Melbourne, speaking about addiction and its relation to trauma. Therefore, I didn't expect that. I thought my testimony may be challenged, but I didn't expect my expertise to be challenged. Now, this is where it gets complicated. So I interviewed this patient, I shouldn't say patient. He wasn't a patient. He was a defendant. And I wasn't working as a physician anymore, nor was I claiming to act as a physician. I was claiming to act as somebody who knows about addiction. And now 3 psychiatrists had interviewed him. 3 forensic psychiatrists, 2 for the defense, 1 for the prosecution. What none of them had uncovered is that this was a very traumatized individual. Most of them reported that he had had a happy childhood. I spoke to him, and his happy childhood included a father who was an alcoholic, a brother who, when this defendant was age 4, threw him to the ground and broke his arm and set fire to his hair, bullying in school, and other things. And none of this was reported by any of the psychiatrists. Now, the significance is that these experiences, according to modern brain science, actually change the brain. They change the brain in many ways. They make the brain more prone to addictive behaviors for 2 reasons. two major reasons. One is that they actually have an impact on the brain circuitry itself, so that people with such experiences, to put it very simply, biochemically, their cerebrum is almost crying out for addictive substances to make them feel better in order to restore some kind of balance. So we're talking about brain development now. And I'm not talking about my theories here. I'm talking about what brain science teaches us. This is not even vaguely controversial. It's not vaguely controversial, but 99.99% of psychiatrists are completely unaware of it, because this information is not taught in the medical schools yet. The medical schools are like 40 years behind the science. Now, the second reason that such experiences predisposed to addictions is that they're very painful, and all addictions are attempts to escape from pain. This didn't figure into the documents submitted to the court by the experts. Furthermore, and this did figure, at least in the defense-instigated psychiatric reports, long-term substance use itself changes the brain. So in the first place, children who have traumatic experiences, they have less impulse control, which means that the part of the brain that is supposed to say no when a negative or aggressive impulse arises just goes offline. This, again, is not controversial neuroscientifically, but again, most court experts, let alone judges, lawyers, and so on, have no clue that this is the reality. But you can show this in brain scans. In fact, it has been shown repeatedly in brain scans. So these childhood experiences itself undermine the development of the parts of the brain that regulate impulses. And they overdevelop the parts of the brain that react out of rage and fear. Furthermore, drug use over the years will further undermine impulse regulation. And essentially, these people are not working with a fully functional adult brain. So when it comes to their behaviors, I'm not making an illegal judgment here. I'm saying that biochemically and neurophysiologically, they literally don't know what they're doing, especially when under the influence of substances, and especially when under the influence of severe emotions, such as this man was working under. So this is the information I was going to bring to the court, but I never got to doing that. The prosecution was determined not to have me qualified. And I have to say, they did their job beautifully. I mean, if my job as a prosecutor is to exclude or to strive to exclude testimony that might undermine my case, if that's who you see your job as a prosecutor, this person did a brilliant job. If my interest as a representative of the court system is to open to the truth, I saw none of that. What I saw was, and let me tell you, this is where my poor lack of impulse control got into it, was a person who, and again, she did it brilliantly. Her job was to discredit me. So she said things about my positions that were totally untrue, but they triggered me. And my response was hostility. I mean, they said things that they'd written or said that I'd never said or written, implied or even thought. They quoted things I'd said out of context. Essentially, I experienced myself, and I have to tell you, I'm being self-critical here. I shouldn't have experienced myself that way, but I did experience myself as under personal attack. And when I experience myself under personal attack, I get arrogant and I get aggressive. I get impatient, and that's how I showed up in that courtroom. Now, here I was, age 74, I think, a best-selling international author, millions of people watching my YouTube videos. I get all this respect out there in the world, well-credentialed. My life did not depend on this court trial. Just perhaps my attachment to my ego was dependent on it, but not certainly anything that would happen to me. And yet I felt like a babbling idiot and somebody under siege. Now, were I to do it again, I realized what was going on. This was a game. This had nothing to do with justice or truth. This was a game that somebody was trying to win. If I'd gone into it like a chess player, prepared to do so, that the opponent's attacks in a chess game are not personal. They're just trying to win the game. And if I get emotional about it, I'm going to lose that chess game. My job is to stay clear and calm and cool and just on the game. I know exactly how to play that game right now. I'd be so polite. I'd be so cool. I'd be so reasonable. I'd be so respectful. But you see, it's a game that nobody had prepared me for. And what I got out of it was that if I, with all my expertise, all my intellectual confidence, all my advantages in the world, and the minimal threat that I was really under, if I could be so disconcerted and discombobulated, what happens to the average defendant who doesn't have my advantages, whose fate is at stake, who's traumatized, who feels isolated, whom even the psychiatrists on his side don't quite understand, and who's subjected to this kind of hostile, supercilious, disdainful, disrespectful, aggressive questioning? Well, I really got a sense of what it's like, a small taste of it, to be a defendant in a court system which is not designed to elicit truth, but to win cases. And of course, what was salient, and this is what the court system does not understand, I'm not telling you my personal opinions here. I'm giving you the science. The vast majority of people who end up in the court system, whether because of addiction or crimes related to addiction or aggression and so on, they're there because of trauma. This is not controversial scientifically. I could spend 5 days, 24 hours a day telling you about all the scientific evidence. I could share with you thousands of research papers on my computer. The average medical student does not hear a word about trauma in all their training. They don't have a single lecture on it, let alone a whole course. They don't get a single lecture on how the child's brain development is actually conditioned by the emotional environment. I'm talking about the physiology of the human brain.
Would it surprise you to know that law students also don't get any kind of education in trauma?
It doesn't surprise me because I know it to be a fact, not just here in Canada, but internationally. And my brushes with the court system, like as a family physician, there were some family court cases that came across my desk. I was appalled by the lack of trauma awareness, but the lack of developmental awareness of how does a human being actually develop, not just on the part of the court, but saliently on the part of the psychologists that prepare reports for the court. It's astounding when you compare the actual scientific body of evidence and research with the gap. It's called the science policy gap, actually. There's a huge gap between the science and policies that show up in the legal world, in the political world, and certainly in the medical world. And I'm telling you, don't take my word for it, but also don't reject it out of hand either. Check it out. One of the world's leading psychiatrists, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of a major book on trauma, he says that something like 90% of the people in jail in the U.S. are there because of childhood trauma. And people who are traumatized, they don't behave well, and they're not particularly likable necessarily. And those are all the outcomes of trauma. And I'm telling you, in the courtroom, when I was there, you know what showed up in the courtroom was my own trauma, my own sense of threat. And that relates to my infancy. That's not the court's fault. That's my own stuff. I've done a lot of work on it. I wish I had gone to the courtroom more prepared to have that show up and more prepared for my adult brain circuits to stay in charge. But that's not what happened. That's entirely my responsibility. I'm not blaming the court for that. But the court is set up to exacerbate and to exploit that very fact.
What would you say is wrong with this system that could benefit from change? Does it need a complete overhaul? Does it need to be, placed into a coma and then brought back to life later on?
Well, I will answer that question, but let me address something you said that's very important first, which is what people don't realize. This is true in emergency wards on the part of nurses and doctors. And I used to be the family practice consultant to the psychiatry department at St. Paul's Hospital. So I dealt with all kinds of people in states of addiction and mental illness and so on. It's sometimes in very aggressive state or very needy state. What the doctors and nurses don't get any training in is what's being called a new branch of science called interpersonal neurobiology. Interpersonal neurobiology simply means that the biology of our brains is actually affected by our relationships. So my brain doesn't exist in separation from yours. The brain is a social organ. If I were to raise my voice or alter my facial expression right now, if I was to express disdain or judgment or rejection, your biology would change immediately, even though we're talking by Zoom, not even in close proximity physically. Now, what if I had power over you and I expressed those behaviors and those traits on my face, which is the situation of child and parent, by the way. But it's also the situation of our authority figure and most of the clients that you're going to deal with. These are people immature not as a moral judgment, but lack of maturity because the conditions for healthy maturation were not there in their life. So then you show up as the nurse, as the doctor, as the judge, sitting literally on your high perch, looking down on somebody, or the lawyer in your robes and with your language and your articulation and your my honored friend and this and that, and your trained upper class diction, and you're talking to some lower class individual, perhaps a First Nations person, who incidentally, although they make up 4% of the Canadian population, they also make up 30% of the jail population for some strange reason, perhaps to do with trauma. And so when you speak to them in a certain way, that triggers certain brain circuits. So when I was in court, again, I'm acknowledging this is my responsibility. I should have known better, but it was my defensive circuits that got triggered. And when people are defensive, they go into one of two major modes, either aggressive, which is what I did, or freeze. Their brain just freezes up and their memory memory escapes them, they can't speak articulately, or they just become passive. So this is interpersonal neurobiology. And you don't realize the impact that you have on another person who essentially, whether you like it or not, is within your power. And that's how the court system is set up. Now, in terms of what I would do about the criminal justice system, well, the first thing I would do, Myrna, is I would take the designation criminal justice system very seriously. It is a criminal justice system. And what I mean by this is not going to endear me to everybody listening here. And I'm not impugning individual motivations. I think everybody, or most people go into law, like most people go into medicine, they just want to do good. They want to keep people safe. They want to protect society. They want justice. So I'm not talking about individuals. But the system, what is criminality? When people who deserve better are hurt. This system does that every day, simply by not understanding human beings, let alone the so-called correction system, which doesn't correct anything. It just makes things worse. And I could go on about that for days as well. We call it a correctional system. Who does it correct? So how would I reform it? I would first of all ground the education of legal personnel in an awareness of human needs, human psychology, human development, and trauma. I'm not saying that people should not be held responsible, but responsible is very different from blame. And I'm not saying society does not need to be protected, but protecting society and further traumatizing the so-called criminal are not compatible. So I would reform the legal system by first of all informing the system of human development and human trauma. Number one. Number two, I would then design, not that I would design them, but I would look to the designing by people that are expert in this of ways of being in the courtroom, of communication, of procedures that actually are human friendly. And then of course of a correctional system that really is designed to correct things, not just to isolate and punish people.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up that piece about redesigning systems within the courtroom. I was reading a sentencing decision not that long ago by an Ontario judge, Patrice Band. They were sentencing an individual on a child pornography case. Of course, as you know, those types of cases are really heavy and can have a real psychological impact on people who are not just investigating those matters, but trying them and adjudicating them. So this judge, he was really urging lawyers to find a better way to bring this kind of evidence into a courtroom to really mitigate against traumatizing other justice participants or legal actors, whether they're court officials or the judge himself, and essentially imploring folks, we've got to do more research on this. We have to find a better way. We have to maybe change our rules of evidence to recognize the harmful traumatic effects graphic evidence can have on us and really change and innovate and modernize our systems. And so I'm curious about what your thoughts are on really his call for action and transformation within our process, particularly around these types of cases that could be quite graphic, whether it's child pornography or murder or even some domestic violence cases.
First of all, I welcome that perspective. That what the judge seems to be saying is that there ought to be some trauma sensitivity in the courtroom, and absolutely there should be. I would say it needs to go well beyond those very charged and the triggering cases. I'm saying that everything that comes in front of you, virtually everything that comes in front of you, has some traumatic origin, including, by the way, the pornography addiction of the defendant in this case. That's a traumatized person. Trauma is the basis of those kind of addictions. And again, I'm not saying they shouldn't be held responsible or that children and society doesn't need to be protected from this terrible plague of pornography addiction and the exploitation of children. And it's horrible. Can we do that protection of society with still some empathy even for that hurt human being who perpetrated it? Can we hold them to account and at the same time recognize their experience? Now, that calls for a kind of deep compassion and deep understanding that people aren't just trained in. Now, as to the specifics of it, yes, it can be. I mean, we know this. I mean, this is now a cliche, although it's hardly penetrated the legal consciousness. Sexual assault victims are traumatized over and over and over again in the courts. I'm telling you something. I'll give you an example. The Jim Ghomeshi case, very famous. Now, there's one little fact that never entered the court's consciousness. The prosecution who was trying to convict Ghomeshi didn't know it. These women in the courtroom had unstable memories. They said he was wearing one kind of shirt one day, and then next time they said he was wearing a different kind of shirt. Furthermore, they remained in contact with him sometimes, even after those alleged assaults. Therefore, there's something wrong with their testimony. No, That's the nature of traumatic memory. Anybody trained in traumatic memory can tell you what that's about. Furthermore, I'll tell you something else. The perpetrator always knows who to choose. Gian Gomeshi had contact with hundreds of women. He didn't hit on hundreds of them, and he didn't hit hundreds of them. He knew. The perpetrator knows with laser-like certainty who's vulnerable and who isn't. And so that they tend to choose unwittingly and automatically and kind of intuitively. Well, why is that? That has to do with their own traumatic self. But they can recognize the lack of defense and the boundarylessness and the vulnerability of the potential victim. So these are precisely the people that you can abuse, and they'll come back to you afterward. And for the courts to use that to dismiss the validity of these women's complaint stands truth on its head. And nobody in that courtroom knew that. And so this man who had the funds to engage a highly aggressive legal mind could destroy the veracity or the seeming veracity of these alleged victims and traumatize them further in the process. Now, it doesn't take much. I'm just telling you how it is.
As I've learned about trauma, particularly in my work, I've come to learn that when someone can't think in an organized and chronological manner, when people stutter and really grasp to try to remember evidence, particularly when they're on the stand, in retrospect, as I've learned about trauma, I now know that is likely an indicator of trauma.
Let me tell you something. If you took that person at the moment on the stand and they're stuttering and they're misremembering and they're confusing, and you did a brain scan, you know what you would see? Because it's been done. The front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, where insight, judgment, impulse regulation, body self-regulation governed, is offline. And what you see is activation of the brain's fear centers, an overwhelming of the brain's memory centers with cortisol, which impairs memory. You'd see, in other words, a dysfunctional brain. Because what you've done is the very accusatory tone and the whole cold, rigid, hierarchical setup of the courtroom puts them right back into the childhood trauma. And under stress, those prefrontal cortex circuits go offline. So that's what you would see.
Interesting. And I think it's something that we as lawyers need to investigate more, understand that an individual could experience shaking. This is now a trigger of something else.
Yeah, well, that's a typical sign of trauma. I mean, that's if you look at the specific definition of PTSD, which is a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is only a very narrow range of the trauma responses. But precisely what it is, I hear a car backfiring on the street out there, and I leap under the table because I think I'm in battle again and people are shooting at me. The operative word is trigger it, which is what you use. When I teach people therapy and all this, I use that word. It's a great word because if you look at what trigger, the metaphor trigger, if you look at a weapon, how big a part of the weapon is the actual trigger? Tiny little thing. What really matters is that there's ammunition there, there's an explosive there, and there's a whole machinery for delivery of that ammunition. And we could focus on the trigger, or we could see what's the explosive and what's the ammunition. And that's conditioned by the person's life. So the overreaction, in other words, when the reaction seems to be out of proportion to the present stimulus, is always a sign of trauma. And what's happened is that brain circuits loaded with that explosive charge of pain and rage and fear are now being activated. And that's what the triggering actually means.
So maybe when lawyers see that kind of reaction, that should be a flag to them.
Only 100% of the time. And this happens in personal life all the time. I mean, in personal relationship, your spouse says something and all of a sudden you're going, guess what's showing up? Your childhood is showing up. But of course, in the court system, this has life-altering implications when this is misunderstood and mishandled, as it is all the time. Let me add something else here that just occurs to me. And again, I don't know how anybody listening will receive this. Judges and lawyers are not themselves free from their own triggers. I'll tell you a story. Some years ago when I was working in the downtown east side, and I was working at the supervised injection site, and the federal government at the time, as you know, wanted to shut it down. It was the only such facility in Canada, North America at that time. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the judges unanimously decided that this is an essential medical service that the government had no right to shut down, although they gave the government lots of latitude not to allow the opening of new ones. But I was invited to be part of a panel at the UBC Medical School, in which I participated. The lawyer for the supervised injection site participated, as did the lawyer for the government. And we all gave our points of view. And I asked this man who represented the government, I said, look, here's the reality. Documentably, if my side wins the case, lives are going to be saved. Documentably, and you know the studies, if your side wins the case, people are going to die. How do you feel about that? What do you do with that? He said, well, my job is not to decide the law. My job is to make sure that the law is applied as it's intended. Now, that to me is a person who is separate from his own heart and his own compassion. Because from the point of view of human compassion, how can you even consider saying that? That I don't care that if people die as a result of what I do? Now, I'm not judging the man. What I'm actually saying is something happened to him to create that separation between his compassionate heart that probably shows up in other aspects of his life, but he's able to separate it. And people even celebrate that separation in the court system. Well, I'm suggesting that people look at their own stuff.
Which I think for some lawyers and judges is probably the most terrifying advice that you could give. I've seen like judges and lawyers perpetuating a lot of trauma in the courtroom and in an interview room before you even get into the courtroom.
And they're doing it unwittingly, and they're doing it with the best of intentions, but they're doing it out of a disconnect. That disconnect is a sign of trauma. And believe me, a lot of the medical world functions that way as well. So, I mean, essentially, it's a self-perpetuating system.
Absolutely. I've been reading a little bit what you call compassionate inquiry. Do you think that has a space or like a place within our justice system, that same approach?
Well, you see, the most prominent dynamic in the court system is inquiry, isn't it? Let's find out what happened. Let's find out who did it. When I say who did it, I don't just mean what person did it, but who that person was when they did it. Let's find out why it happened. Now, we can engage in that inquiry with hostility or indifference or with compassion for everybody, because every court case represents some human tragedy, not just for the victims, but also for the perpetrators. I'm not saying the two should be equated, but they're human beings on both sides. So, you know what? I'm telling you something. If I could spend a day with 20 or 300 lawyers teaching them compassionate inquiry, it would transform their practice. I know this is where my arrogance comes in, but this is not arrogance, it's confidence, because I know that people want to do good. And that's why they're there. Nobody goes into law. I mean, some people, you can go into corporate law or business law just because you want to make money, and it's a legitimate way to make money, and you become good at something, and there's all kinds of positives about it. But where really justice and so on is of secondary consideration, really it's about, what is legal, what is not, what is permissible, what is not. But my guess is that a lot of people go into law, as I said earlier, because they really want to serve justice. And whether they're on the prosecutorial side or the defense side or in the judicial chair, it's justice that they want. Well, how can you have justice without compassion? I see anything that's more compassionate and more informed as a step forward. So it's like the drug courts. I think the mandate is too narrow. I think the whole system should be characterized by that approach. But short of that, it's a step forward. It's a step in the right direction. Look, as I mentioned, I worked in the downtown east side for 12 years there. All of my patients have been through the court system. In 12 years in the downtown east side, I didn't meet a single woman who had not been sexually abused as a child. All the men had been neglected, abused, tormented significantly. And then these are the people that the court systems further torment and don't understand at all. So any step forward in that direction. And by the way, this is a whole other conversation, but not just addiction, but most mental illness is also rooted in trauma. And that's a whole other long conversation. So anything that's going to bring that kind of awareness, even a stitch forward, I'd be very happy about. But really, it needs to penetrate the whole court system.
Thank you for that. So I'd like to know what, in your opinion, is something you would want to tell any lawyers and judges or law students or legal academics they need to know that they don't know about trauma.
So trauma, the Greek origin of the word trauma is specifically a wound. So traumatized people are wounded people. And these wounds show up in how their brains are formed, how their brains function, in their psychology, and in their behavior. And when you have a wound, if you touch that wound that's unhealed, if you touch that wound, it hurts a lot. That's what happens to a lot of people. These are unhealed wounds. You touch them in a sore spot, you're going to get some overwhelming reaction. You say, I just touched you. What are you so upset about? So we talked about that before. Or what happens when there's a wound there? There's scar tissue. And scar tissue is hard and thick, so it has no nerve ending, so you don't feel stuff through it. So you can be unfeeling in your responses. It's rigid. You don't have the flexibility to respond as you would ordinarily. So you lose response flexibility. But you know what? What I would say about, in a larger sense, don't look for me to answer this question in a couple of minutes. If you become aware of the issue, for God's sakes, educate yourself. You want to know about addiction, all the addicted people? Read my book, In the Realm of Hungry Growth. Read Bruce Alexander's book, a wonderful Vancouver psychologist, The Globalization of Addiction. He talks about the larger social forces that drive addictions. Read the book by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, world trauma expert, psychiatrist from Boston, The Body Keeps the Score. Read the work of Dr. Peter Levine, trauma expert, Waking the Tiger, or In an Unspoken Voice. Or he's written a book called Traumatic Memory. That should be a textbook in our law schools, by the way. Read the work of the Canadian psychiatrist and researcher Ruth Lanius on trauma. There's just a world and a wealth of literature out there. Watch the YouTube. If you don't have time to read, watch my lectures on YouTube. Many of them that have been posted. Doesn't cost you a penny. Watch Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's interviews. Watch Peter Levine's interviews. Go to Netflix. There's a film right now called Cracked Up, which is about the Saturday Night Live comedian Daryl Hammond and his addiction history and his trauma history. I mean, it's just resources are up. So that, what do? Open your mind to the possibility that there's something here that you don't know that you should know. And in general, I found in my life, it's what we don't know that gets us into trouble. So if you realize that you don't know it, that's already a step forward.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was my interview with Gabor Maté, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I know that I really enjoyed talking to him, and honestly, I could have went on and on and on because I'm an avid learner in this area, and I know that no matter how much I read or watch or listen, there will always be more to learn to improve the way I approach lawyering. If you want to learn a little bit more about trauma-informed practice or trauma awareness, Gabor gave us a really beautiful reading list, and he also noted that he's got YouTube videos online and that there's a Netflix show currently streaming. So there's no shortage of places to get informed. Become trauma aware, become compassionate. How do we begin to practice compassionate inquiry? Begin by becoming compassionate with the way you talk to yourself. I also learned that from my conversation with Gabor. I hope you really enjoyed the show. I hope you'll come back for more. Next week, I will be talking to you about what you need to know to become a trauma-informed lawyer. We'll talk about some key practices found in trauma-informed lawyering, including empathetic engagement, active listening, asserting boundaries, and responding to the uncomfortable emotions of others. Till next time.